Hello, everybody, and happy Thursday. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Find My Past from Home, and today is actually in recognition of a very important and very special day. My name is Jen Baldwin. I'm the research specialist at Find My Past, and I am thrilled today to be joined by Lori Oschefski. Oschefski. I know I messed that up. Oschefski. You say
Oschefski.
it. Thank you.
Oschefski.
I practiced and everything.
That's okay.
Lori is the president of Home Children Canada, which is a Canadian charity. And today, of course, is Home Child Day. It's a day where we acknowledge the thousands of child migrants that were sent outside of the UK into various parts of the Empire and the Dominion. We'll get into that. But I want to introduce Lori before we get too far into this. Lori and I connected, probably a couple of years ago now, as I started to learn about this effort. And she is an incredible fountain of information, globally recognized for her advocacy for the rights and recognition of home children and her knowledge in this space. So Lori runs, again, Home Children Canada. She is the president of that organization. Their efforts have raised global awareness, but also successfully reunited fractured families, which were torn apart by these migration programs. Today, descendants continue to seek information about their ancestors, and an increasing number are uncovering their profound connections to these young child migrants. The organization really started in 2010, but her passion for this cause was really ignited in 2007. So Lori's been working on this for quite a long time. Lori, thank you so much for being with us on
Thank
Find
you
My
for
Past from
having
Home.
us.
Yeah, we are thrilled. Do you want to just get started by just telling us maybe a little bit about how you got into this? What was your motivation? What was your inspiration for learning about and kind of creating this organization?
For the home children, it goes right back to my mother. And I knew all my life that there was something that had really profoundly bothered and upset my mother. And it was a huge struggle for her to even finally open up and say something. And I came in to see her one day. She was 86 years of age. And, and this is one of the common things that we find with the home children is that they don't open up and they don't tell. They haven't even told their own families. And a lot of them took this secret to their graves. But I came in to see her one day and she's really stewing in the corner. I mean, I knew that I just needed to sit there and be quiet and wait until she was ready to open up and say something to me. And she finally did. And she said, I was born in England, and I'm kind of looking at her and I'm thinking, well, I'm not saying anything, but I'm thinking, no, I don't know. Like, why would I know that? Because you always told us that you were born in Ontario. And she was one of the lucky children that ended up with a good home and a good family who looked after her whole life. So, I mean, we knew them as our grandparents. I had no idea in the whole wide world that they weren't biologically our grandparents. And, and I'm kind of looking at her and she said, well, she, had been adopted. And, she asked me, she said she knew nothing about her life prior to the age of 2. And she asked me to look into her background. She wanted to know what had happened back there that had taken her away from her biological family. And so I started doing research, and I had never done any type of family history research, really. And I started doing research and soon uncovered this past that she had. And it wasn't only her was a home child, her father was also a home child. So I've got 2 generations of them in my own family. So, and it's, I think it's the suffering that these children, these children endured. I mean, we can get into the whole gamut of things that happen to the children and, neglect and abuse and things that a lot of them did endure. But I think on the whole, they were all separated from their families. And a lot of the children spent the vast majority of their lives, often unsuccessfully, seeking their family roots and where they came from and who their brothers and sisters were. And I think, for my mother, that was the most profound loss that she could suffer. And, and it was through finding her family, finding the brothers and sisters and reuniting them that I saw a healing take place in my mom. And And it's that healing that I saw in my mom that I just feel as we move forward with this work. That's one of the things that we really aim to bring to families, to reunite them, to bring them the understanding of what really happened, and 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 heal the families.
It's incredible work to do. Thank you so much for sharing your very personal story with us. I'll take a second to go into the comments like we normally do. Victoria mentioned that I was lightning quick on. You're right, Victoria. I wanted to make sure that Lori got a chance to really explain just that, right? Why she does this work. I think it's really important to kind of set that foundation right at the beginning. So it's wonderful to see some of our regular community members. And of course, Charlotte is in the comments with us. Thank you so much, Charlotte, for being here and helping us out today. So we've got Victoria and Bobby and Daphne and Andrea, and who else? Gina's with us, and Ellen in Illinois and Georgia, over in Essex, and Daphne in Somerset, all sorts of people chiming in.
Awesome.
It's great to have you with us. Tina's in Oriah. I'm not sure I said that right. And then Rosie, we're very glad that you joined us, Rosie. She's already told us she has two ancestors who were home children in Canada in the 1880s. So, Rosie, hopefully, if you haven't looked into those people, hopefully today will inspire you to do so. That's one of our objectives for today, is really to kind of raise awareness of these migration campaigns and really share these stories so that people can understand that it does impact family history research on both sides of the ocean, and
Absolutely.
certainly not just Canada as well, right? So I think probably just should start with a little bit of background in terms of the home children migration schemes, and kind of what they were, how they got going, and kind of very high level view of a bit of that history, so people understand really what we're talking about.
The migration programs began back in 1869, or just a little bit prior to that, with Maria Rye in London, who set up homes for little girls, but she started immigrating the girls to Canada. Like I said, in 1869, the first party arrived. I mean, it all began with things like the Industrial Revolution. Really was one of the primary causes of this particular segment of child migration from the UK, because we know that child migration went on for about 350 years total type thing. But this was a specialized kind of, it was structured, it was more organized. And of course, you had, the Industrial Revolution caused an overcrowding of cities, like in London and stuff like that. A lot of poverty, and something really had to happen. Something had to, had to be formed to look after the children in the streets and stuff. So you had Annie McPherson, Maria Rye, that started taking in the kids. And of course, and Maria Rye had been involved with the immigration of young women, but Canada didn't want the young women because they considered them to be immoral. And so she took a look at the younger children. And it was a fella from the United States, from Chicago, who was involved with the orphan trains that ran through the United States. And he had come up in the late 1870s and was lecturing in London. And Maria Rye happened to be in that audience. So it was through him that she really formed that idea about sending the children to Canada, and not, to get the girls before they were immoral or before they could form those habits, and then bring them to Canada. So she actually went into the United States and did an overview of how those schemes were working in the States, came back up through Canada. She went into Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is one of the most beautiful areas in Canada. She secured property up in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and went back to England and put her first shipment of kids together. And by November, they had started their journey out of the UK to Canada to, begin new lives. Maria Rye came, Annie McPherson came after her. And there was Dr. Stevenson from the National Children's Home. And then in this whole mix, one of the best known people that were involved in the migration of children was Dr. Thomas Bernardo. And I know a lot of people in England and Scotland, they know about Dr. Bernardo, but they don't really know that he was involved in this program. I mean, I was just speaking to a fella yesterday who knows all about Dr. Bernardo, but he had no idea that he was involved in the migration of children from the UK. So, I mean, in total, there was over 50 sending organizations that were responsible for bringing children out of the UK into Canada. Children were also sent to New Zealand, Rhodesia, and Australia. And there's a lot that is known about the children that went to Australia, because those migration programs continued until about 1972. In Canada, they officially came to an end in about 1939, but unofficially, the Fairbridge Farms brought children after the Second World War, and they went on until about 1948.
So I was actually in Cheshire just about 2 weeks ago, and saw one of the Barnardo's thrift shops, and I obviously knew that they had existed, but I learned about Dr. Bernardo because of my interest in this particular migration program and the history of the home children. So it was interesting to kind of get that current view of him, and see him kind of his name kind of in situ in modern day England, compared to that historical perspective. So thanks for that summary. It's a good way to kind of start the conversation. And as we've put in the chat, if you have any questions or connections to any of these kind of migration schemes, or any of this starts to sound familiar, please do say so, and let us know. We'd love to hear your stories, but we also want you to have the chance to ask questions of Lori while she is with us today. So if you are researching in this area, or potentially want to start, or you suspect that you might have a member of your family that was sent to one of these other countries, this is the chance to really kind of dive into that with Lori directly. Oh, go ahead, Lori.
I just wanted to make the point, to make it clear that these children weren't sent out of the UK with their families. They were sent alone. I mean, the age ranged from toddlers up to about the age of 18. My mother was 2 years old when she was sent to Canada and separated forever from her biological family. There's a lot of families in the UK to this day that have lost family members, and they have no idea whatever happened to them. Like, we do a lot of research, and I connect with a lot of families that had no idea that that one of their family members was sent out of the country, and be that Australia, New Zealand, Rhodesia, or Canada. They just they have no idea, and that's why working with Find My Past and things are just such a powerful tool to enable us to reconnect those families and to bring this story to them and bring closure.
Yeah, I think let's talk about that for a minute, because it is not necessarily a pleasant topic. Many of these children dealt with and had to endure some real tragic conditions, and they were children, they were toddlers. So can you give us an idea of just, I don't know, maybe just a couple of examples of some of the really horrific conditions that some of these children encountered?
Well, I think from the very start, I mean, it was human trafficking. It was a violation of human rights. They were taken from their families, and you have to understand that children that ended up in care had suffered trauma already in their lives, and that trauma just wasn't recognized for what it really was. And then take a traumatized child and put them into these institutions, and then bring them down to the port, put them on a boat, and take them out of the country into a new country where everything marginalizes for them. Like, the children weren't welcomed in Canada. And I think that's one of the things that we need to really understand, is that they wanted the children here, and they weren't here to find loving homes. That is not the reason they brought the children to Canada. They were brought for work. Now, 2-year-olds like my mother typically would have been fostered out until she was considered old enough to do farm work. And when she was old enough to do farm work, they would foster them out, and they would pay the farmer a bit of money, to keep that child. And then when she was ready, when they were ready to work, the farmer had the choice of either paying the sending organization now for the work that would have been expected from a child, or send that child back to the organization. I mean, Dr. Bernardo himself in 1890 wrote an article in one of his magazines he wrote called Ups and Downs. And he said that we are not so young and unsophisticated as to imagine that a farmer takes a boy for love. His primary object in taking a boy is that so his services will be useful to him. Canada, from the very start, considered these children to be diseased and defective. Poverty itself was considered a disease back in the years that that these programs were going on. The things that they said about the children in the Canadian press, in our medical community, and in our House of Commons was so harsh and so abusive. I mean, we had Frederick Nichols, who was a member of our House of Commons, and in 1898, he wrote an article. He was the head of the Canadian Manufacturers Association, and he wrote an article saying that these waifs and strays are tainted and corrupt with moral slime and filth inherited from parents of the most foul and disgusting character. And all the cleansings and clean clothes that Dr. Bernardo may bestow will never possibly fit them so that they will become desirable citizens of Canada. And I think that statement alone underpins really the general feeling and outlook on these children in Canada. So therefore, when they got here, I mean, we had our medical doctors saying that they had syphilis and that they were going to contaminate our good Canadian stock with their diseases and their degeneracies. So when it came down to the common farmer, who would have trusted those sources, they wouldn't allow the kids to mingle with their own families. They wouldn't allow them to sleep in regular bedrooms, or, a lot of kids were made to sleep in barns and attics and, that kind of thing. And they were disciplined very harshly. I've got Arthur Clarkson, who was made to sleep in an unheated attic. And, it didn't have glass in his window. So the snow came in at night and mounted up over his feet. His feet got frostbitten and became blistered and infected. And when the doctor just gave him a larger pair of boots, which just effectively tore the flesh off his feet. And then when Arthur got sick, so sick he couldn't even get out of bed, the doctor or the farmer went up and pulled him out of bed and horsewhipped him. And, fortunately, he was caught with the Bernardo's inspector. At least he wasn't caught. That's the wrong way to say it. The farmer was caught by the inspector from Bernardo's, and he was removed. But I have about 18 of these home children in my family tree, and I have one aunt, Mary Taylor, who was moved to 20 different placements in 8 years. She was whipped, she was beaten, she was raped. She gave birth to a stillborn baby at the age of 14, which was a huge problem. And the sending organization knew all about that, because I've got the full records, and there's pages and pages and pages. It's all in the records. And yet not once did they step in to stop the abuse that was raining down on her head. I mean, it continued relentlessly until she figured it out herself and was able to get away. Now, and having said all that, I mean, we also have to keep in mind that we did have families here in Canada that did treat the children remarkably well. I mean, in the case of my mother, she was never abused. She was never made to work on a farm. She was loved. She was accepted into the family as their child, educated, became a nurse. But nobody told her that she had, brothers and sisters. Nobody told her about the past. And eventually it comes out. And it did come out for my mom. And it came out in not a very nice way. And it came out in a way that affected her for the rest of her life. So, it's in the end of the day, after all these years of researching home children and listening to the good, the bad stories and all the rest of it, it wasn't a good thing that they did with the home children. Not at all. And, we've got what happened in the UK, but we also, have what happened in Canada, which really was not good.
Deep breath, everybody. And that is right there is why we are doing this session today. Exactly. I think the awareness. There's been a lot of comments, tragic story, it's heartbreaking, it's
It is.
horrific. It really is.
It is.
It was. And I think facing that reality is part of our responsibility today as a civilization, is being able to say, yes, this happened. But now we need to do better, and we need to learn from this, and we need to make sure that those families are as reunited as we can make them. And I don't have any home children in my family tree. I don't have anybody who experienced this, but I feel a deep responsibility to engage in this in some way and try to contribute to that wealth of knowledge and that library of knowledge, so that people can find their connections and those children that got sent out. Yeah, I'm going to take a deep breath myself because
Absolutely. When you get
yeah.
into it, it's not a good story. And but I think, as we move forward in our recognition, we also have to acknowledge that most of the home children that came to Canada, and there was a lot of deaths. I mean, I have a cemetery plot up in Etobicoke in Toronto that has 77 of these children buried there for a whole variety of reasons. But most of the home children survived, and most of them went on to make good lives and create good families and make great contributions, not only to Canada, because they all didn't stay in Canada. A lot went back to the UK, a lot went into the United States, but they really did contribute to any country where they went and where they settled. I mean, and you can't thank the sending organizations. It's their own tenacity and their own will to overcome.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had one question early on that I think segues nicely into this. Daphne asked if Canada ever publicly apologized. That Australia did. She's aware of that, but you can speak very, very well to the apology situation in Canada right now.
No, Canada has not officially apologized, as in an official Government of Canada apology. We've been petitioning for an apology since 2012. In 2018, there was a House of Commons apology, which was passed. It was about a 5-minute motion that was passed in the House of Commons, which was a fantastic event for us. But the Government of Canada has not yet apologized. You are correct that Australia did apologize. 2009, 2010 was when England apologized and Australia. And it was right on the cusp of the release of a movie. I don't know if anyone's heard of Oranges and Sunshine. And it's the life story of Margaret Humphreys from Australia, who really broke open the child migration programs into Australia. And it's a pretty hard-hitting film. And they apologized just before that was released. But the apologies were so heartfelt. Honestly, it was really the Australian apology that really hit me hard, and I think it really drove me to really take up the torch for the children in Canada. We are doing an official Government of Canada apology now. We have a lot of political support behind us, and we'll actually be in Ottawa, speaking to the members of our House of Commons in November. And that's one of the things that are, that's on our list to speak about, is the apology. But also, we have education. I mean, we want to be properly represented in our museums. There's a lot of work to be done.
Definitely. Thank you for that. And then just a couple, I just want to scroll through some of these comments because there's an awful lot of people kind of now chiming in. Go ahead,
Sorry.
Lori.
I'm sorry. I had just one more comment about when Australia and the United Kingdom apologized, when England apologized to the home children. Our immigration minister at the time, Jason Kenney, stood up and gave a statement to the press, and he said that there was no need to apologize for the abuse and exploitation of hundreds of young children brought to our shores. I really don't get that, because, I mean, that's a statement right there where he's acknowledging that these children were abused and exploited. He knew full well that 2 other countries were apologizing to them, but why Canada felt that they didn't need to is it's beyond me. I don't understand that.
Certainly, I would think a point of resentment, and makes any further action from the Government of Canada that much more important and impactful, as long as it's sincere. Yeah, so let's scroll through some of the comments. Lots of people chiming in, and I know I recognize some of the names of people joining us from the Home Children Canada Research Group on Facebook. So that's a wonderful resource. So Sue from Belleville in Ontario, her grandfather and grand uncle in the 1920s. Victoria, one of our regular listeners and watchers, grandmother lived in Barkingside, so I knew all about Bernardo's from her, and the headquarters were there. Bonnie saying that her grandmother was a British home child and was one of the first girls brought to Peterborough in 1884, 10 years old. She was sent to work as a domestic servant 1 week later. So she had a week to acclimatize, for lack of a better word. At 10 years old, that's pretty tough to do. Tina, her great uncle in 1911, arrived in Quebec at the age of 15. Her grandfather was cleared to go a couple years later, but because of the war, he didn't go. And of course, the war, World War I in this case, was hugely impactful on these programs. Do you want to tell us just a little bit about how the war changed, like what happened during the war, and what did these individuals do?
The war was a really interesting time for the migration of children to, because it stopped. They didn't send children through the First World War. And the reasons why they didn't are very complicated. It was this, there was a lot of conversations going on between the Canadian government and the sending organizations. And of course, with, young men from either country being pulled out of the countries and sent to war, it left a huge labor shortage in both countries. But Canada was pretty keen that they were going to continue bringing kids into this country. It was the sending organizations that put their back up, and Bernardo's was one of the most outspoken at the time, to their credit, that they didn't want the children coming across because they said that the waters were too dangerous, and that they were really risking the child's life by bringing them over. And the Canadian government offered them financial incentives to override those concerns and to continue bringing the children. But to the credit of the sending organizations, even with the increased financial incentives to do it, they refused. So I think it's absolutely incredible, and to their credit that they didn't do that. World War II is another interesting one because child migration stopped in 1939, so just before the outbreak of the Second World War, and there's a lot of discussion in our House of Commons about the home children because they wanted to start sending the guest children to Canada. And guest children were the children that were sent from the UK to Canada to help protect them against the ravages of the war. Now, many times when we're out speaking, people confuse the home children with the guest children. They think they're one and the same, and they're not. They only sent maybe about 1,500 guest children to Canada during the time, but they didn't want this discussion in the House of Commons was that they didn't want them to bear the stigma that the home children had to. And it was a lot of discussion that the children weren't going to be called home children, so they renamed them guest children so they wouldn't be confused. And they were not to be worked. So our prairie provinces didn't initially get any of the guest children out there because they felt that the farmers out in the prairies would be more prone to sticking them out to work in the fields and stuff. So, but in the end, the guest children only came for a matter of a couple months, I think at most. But we had the city of Benares that came across, and it was torpedoed. And 70 of the 90 children that were aboard the city of Benares died coming across. And of course, these were the guest children, not the home children. Yeah. But it's interesting, too, that a lot of those children that perished on the city of Benares when it was torpedoed were sent in a boat about 2 weeks prior to that, which was also torpedoed. Those children were saved, and then they were put on the city of Benares. And a lot of them died, so it's, so there weren't a lot of home children that were, there were no home children basically that were sent during the Second World War, with the exception of Fairbridge, which did send a few in the early 1940s. And then after that, there's home children that came individually in smaller parties of children, like maybe one or two at a time. I've got immigration lists that go up into the 1950s, but we don't know a lot about those children because, they weren't listed as Bernardos or anything like that. When you're looking at the shipping records prior to this time period and up until about 1938, it's often very easy to spot a party of home children because they're just a massive list of children going all the way down. And then it usually has a squiggle on the side that's saying that they're going to Belleville or they're going to Hazelbrae or Toronto or whatever. But I don't think that there's any other mass immigration to children like that you would see that great big long list of kids. But again, some of the immigration agencies would send them one or two at a time as well, too. So it gets pretty challenging to figure it out as to who was a home child and who wasn't.
Yeah, so let's just take a second to recap a couple of the points you just made. So and then I want to take your comments about passenger lists and kind of think about research then for a minute. To be really specific, right? When we're talking about home children, we are talking about forced migration.
That's right.
So when it comes to things like World War II, when you hear in the UK about Pied Piper project where they are taking children as evacuees out of the cities and out into the countryside, this is not the same thing.
No.
When you're talking about evacuees from either war, when the UK is fearful of being invaded by Germany or Japan, this is not the same thing. It's very, very clearly two distinct population groups, I suppose. When we talk about the wars, though, there is, and I feel like I have an idea, and maybe I'm incorrect, but it feels like a relatively high ratio of the children who were sent to Canada and are growing up there, then join the Canadian Expeditionary Force, especially in
You're
World
right.
War I, to either escape their situation or to
Yeah.
potentially use that as a route to get back to the UK. Is that a correct impression? And then what do we do with that information?
And that is absolutely correct. In 1917, they were saying that 100% of all the home children that were in Canada that were eligible to enlist did.
100%.
100%. And we had a lot of home children that were not eligible to enlist that did enlist anyways. We have Alfred Mist, who enlisted at the age of 15, and he fought in both the First and Second World War. Their contribution to the wars cannot be understated. I mean, it was a significant contribution. And we found about 1,400 that didn't make it back from the war, from the First World War. I mean, our stats on the Second World War, we're not even there yet with the Second World War. We need a release of a whole lot more information before we can come up with proper stats for that. But the Second World War, or the First World War, we have 2 Victoria Cross recipients, Claude Nooney and, the name is on the tip of my tongue, Walter Rayfield. I was just reading about Walter Rayfield. And, it's absolutely incredible.
How many home children have you identified then coming into Canada?
There was about 115,000 home children that came to Canada. And it would not surprise me if that number exceeds that. Because there's all kinds of little pockets of information. There's missing children. And, there's also, we're still missing shiploads of children that came.
Sure. And millions of descendants today across the country.
Yeah, it's estimated that there are 4 million descendants of British home children in Canada alone. We're not talking about those that went into the United States, those that returned to the United Kingdom. It's a huge percentage of our population. And even in Canada, we've been doing this work for I don't know how long, but even in Canada, we're barely scratching the surface. You think 4 million and you look at our Facebook group, and I think we're doing really, really well. But we have over 11,000 members in our group. but there's 4,000 descendants in Canada.
Yeah,
It's a
the
lot of
numbers
work.
don't quite add up, right?
No, they
So
no, they don't quite add up, but
yeah.
it just shows you that as we move forward, um, we have to explore new avenues of information and how to make it available and get it out to the public, and to continue educating not only Canada, but people in the UK as well too, or anywhere that these children came up. Now, there's a misconception that kind of floats around that you have to be English or British or Scottish or something like that in order to have been a home child, but there was a lot of home children that were born in different countries. I have now discovered ones that were born in China,
Mm.
Russia, and my mom's brothers and sisters were all born in Canada. So it doesn't matter where you came from. It doesn't matter where you were born. What matters is if you were in the UK and your family fell upon hard times.
Right.
And then you were taken in by one of these organizations, and then you could be shipped to Canada as a home child.
So you've mentioned your Facebook group a couple times. Can you just give us very clearly the name of that group, and so people who are on Facebook and want to learn more can look it up?
Yeah, it's just called the Home Children Canada Research Group. Now, we have a page for Home Children Canada, but that's more of like a business kind of page. But our research group has been active since 2012. We have over 11,000 members in it. And we honestly have some really good researchers in that group that know the ropes for the home children work and stuff specifically. And anyone that wants information, wants help, with your family tree, or you think there could be a home child in your family, you're very welcome to join our group and learn all you can.
So we did share the link in the chat. So people who are on Facebook, you're welcome to check that out. Please do. And then that's perfect segue into the records. You talked a little bit about passenger records. You just mentioned kind of missing branches in your tree. What are kind of the telltale signs? What are the things, the red flags that come up when you're researching for you that go, this could be someone who was sent to another country?
It's if you don't know anything about your grandparents' past, or your grandparents never spoke about when they were a child.
My cat had to make an appearance there.
There's also stories about children coming over at a young age by themselves, which, didn't really happen. I mean, maybe it did, but typically it didn't. Stowaways on a boat, or just any kind of family story that you have that doesn't quite make sense. Then you need to take a second look at it and see if they were part of these programs. And the same goes for the families left back in the UK. It's like I think we've already said that, sometimes there's a missing family member in your tree. You knew they existed, you knew they were born, but you have no further information than that on them. You have no clue whatsoever that they were sent out of the country.
So then from there, what are the first initial steps? Where do you go to start this research process? How do you get access to the resources? What are the most common research resources that your researchers are using?
Well, there's Findmypast. Yes, there is Findmypast, because you guys have got a lot of pertinent information in there for the home children to start with. Also, the release of your 1921 census was a huge boost to our research. Huge. You have no idea. Just with the information that we were able to find there, we were able to put families together that without that information, it wouldn't happen. So huge resources there. We have our British Home Child Registry, and Library and Archives Canada also have a registry up that they're shipping lists and stuff. But there's quite a few resources, but we need more specialized places where we can go.
So really, what we're looking at is kind of everyday common genealogical tools and resources and record collections, but looking at them with kind of a new lens, looking at them with an eye for are they traveling in a large group of children, or are they very young, or do they come from a place of poverty? The 1921 census is a great example because, of course, all the institutes in the UK were listed out individually in the census, so you actually can see the children in Barnardo's homes.
Yes.
Which if you haven't looked at those records yet on the 1921 census, even if you don't think you have someone in this group, please do so, because just looking at that page, that name of lists, is really just enough inspiration to get someone interested in this and going, because you do see 2-year-old all the way up to, even infants all the way up to their young teenage years listed in those facilities, and those have all been called out on the census. So there are tools that we can use. The Library and Archives Canada collections that you mentioned, um, another great resource. And on their website, we have access to the inspection cards. And you and I actually had a conversation not too long ago about those inspection cards and
Mhm.
how reliable they are. Can you give us just a little bit of background on the inspection cards that are available through Library Archives Canada and how we should or should not use them?
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion. I mean, I think a lot of people in Canada are aware of the George Green case, and George Green was brutally murdered by his mistress in 1895. And I'm not going to get into it, but it's on our websites and stuff if you want to read about George, but it was horrific. And there was a lot of pushback in Canada about that. And they actually instated laws in Canada in 1897, and you would think that, and it was based on what happened to George, and you would think that the laws would be, for protection of the children, and in fact they weren't. They were to protect Ontarians from that kind of child coming into Canada. It gets relevant to the inspection reports because in the 1897 law that they instated, they also had provisions in there that there should be inspections done of these kids. Now that's Government of Canada inspections. I know that the Barnardos and places like that. Barnardos was very enlightened, really, for the times and for what they were doing. Barnardos took extensive records on the children that they brought into Canada. Most of them. I mean, some of the records aren't as extensive, but generally they're very extensive records that they had. And but the Government of Canada was to do these inspections. So I think there's a lot of things that they didn't take into consideration. I think there was a lot of space to cover in Canada. They didn't take into consideration, the varying degrees of weather that we had. So in the winter times, it was near impossible to get out and do inspections and stuff like that. And I think one of the things that that we need to understand is it wasn't the inspector's place to remove a child from that farm if they found that that child was being abused. So if they found a case of abuse, they would have to take that back and, it'd have to go through the process. And it could be a matter of time before they sent somebody out to remove that child. So when you're a child and you're on the farm and you know that you're being abused, you're not really going to say anything, are you? I mean, if you know that you're going to be just left with that guy who's been abusing you, because, you're going to get beat up even worse when the inspector left if you said something. A lot of the children were conspicuously absent when the inspectors came around. So a lot of the inspections were just the farmer saying that everything was fine and little Johnny was working out just great. And in fact, that wasn't true. I mean, there's lots of cases that we have found, in particularly in newspapers and different stories and stuff about abuse and all the rest of it. And then you get the inspection report and you read that and everything's fine. But, the newspaper and the truth of it is far different. So I think the inspection reports are good because a lot of the ones that they, started to publish then would tell where the placements were for the children. And I think placements is something that, is something that everyone wants to know is where was your home child place and how many places did they have to go through. So you're going to get that information on the inspection report. You're going to get some idea of what their birth date was. You're going to get some idea of how much pay that the children would be paid for. So once they were of working age, the children could expect a wage to be paid for them in return for their work. Now that wage wasn't necessary. It wasn't paid to the children directly, but it was held in trust by the sending organizations. And, and that becomes another story as well, too. Did they get their pay? But yeah, you're going to get a lot of information on the inspection reports, but I think that you have to take it with a grain of salt. I think you have to realize that it may not be what it's saying.
Sure. So newspapers then, you mentioned, and I have been doing a little bit of digging around, just trying to familiarize myself, really. And one of the things that I have found to be quite successful with the newspapers is actually researching the sending organization, because they're obviously mentioned quite a lot more in the period, right? In kind of in those publications, the children themselves are clearly not named in papers for the most part. But
Yeah.
how do you use newspapers? And on both sides, both sides, right? Either Canadian papers or papers out of the UK.
Yeah, you know what? I do a lot of nosing around in the papers from the UK because I think there's just a lot of valuable information in them altogether. I mean, you get a lot of background information on the sending organizations. I did a lot of research for Emma Sterling, for an example, and I found a lot of her information in the newspapers. And her and William Quarrier had words about the conditions of the children being sent to Canada and stuff like that. So there's a lot of historical content and historical background that you can get from searching the newspapers. For the children themselves, it's really interesting because we have the John T. Middlemore homes that sent children to Nova Scotia. I mean, when you talk about the reasons why these people got involved with child migration, I mean, a lot of it, I believe, was a financial gain. But there were ones that really cared about the kids. And John Middlemore, I believe, was one of those guys. I'm not saying that things turned out any better in Canada, but I think that his, the reason why he got into child migration was, really to save the worst of the worst. So he really worked with a lot of the children that had endured some really terrible, terrible conditions before becoming home children. I mean, and you can find those stories in the historical newspapers in the UK. You can just run down and say, do a search for Middlemore. But sometimes if you know that you have a child that came from the Middlemore homes, it's always worth running their name in the newspaper archives, because you might just come up with something. And not just Bernardo's. I mean, I'm sorry, not just Middlemore. I do recognize that I find a bit more that way through the Middlemore homes, but I've also found things like my aunt Mary that came through Bernardo's. I found stuff in the newspaper archive about her. So, it's a very valuable resource for not only just historical purposes, but also figuring out your own family history. You'd be amazed what you would find.
Yeah, that is very true. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we just have a few minutes left. This hour has gone incredibly fast, and there are so many other things I could ask you, but I do want to go back to comments here for just a minute.
Sure.
Julie, very early on, kind of made a comment that I want to highlight. One of her family was sent to Canada under the McPherson scheme. I've managed to connect to her descendants who didn't know much about her background using DNA and Findmypast to show our connection. And I want to highlight here, the reason I like this comment is because Julie, you're using tools across the entire library of what's available to you, right? Using DNA is obviously important, but also using online trees like you have on Findmypast, especially because so many of our customers are UK based. They have these well-researched, very well-documented trees on Findmypast that you may not find on some of the other sites.
Right.
So that tree matching technology that we're also accustomed to, and some of us don't necessarily trust, and I know there's a lot of opinions out there about that, you really can find some really incredible pieces. I actually just, as an example for the Findmypast team a couple of weeks ago, I took one of the oral testimonies that's on the website for Home Children Canada, and I don't recall his name now, but in his testimony, he says that he never knew the name of his grandfather. And I don't know what happened before that man actually passed away, but within minutes, I knew the name of his grandfather because it was on one of those trees. And I just think about how again, how tragic and how sad that is that I have that information, but he possibly, never did. And I think those are the moments that we're really looking to capture through some of this awareness and just having Lori on with us today. There's another comment that Victoria left that, Victoria, this is so, thank you for this. This is just
Thank you.
really, really
Yeah.
powerful. She says, Find My Past is about giving people voices, educating us, and connecting. And yes, that's exactly what we're trying to do. So this is when I saw your comment come across, Victoria, I actually this is very, very moving. This is exactly why we're having this session today and why we have these sessions on a regular basis. So thank you for that. But also, it's our partners in these relationships with Lori and her organization and other facilities and archives on both sides of the ocean that allow us to be able to tell this story in as a comprehensive way as we possibly can. Right. So I think Find My Past can be a good ally to the home children effort.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, 100%. I mean, we all have our ancestry that traces back to the UK, and the records and stuff that are available on Find My Past and, are just invaluable to our research that we're doing and connecting the families, I mean, and it's like you said too, Jen, I mean, it's the family trees.
Yeah.
And to be able to find that connection and, and to be able to put these fractured families back together. I mean, our home children, most of them didn't survive long enough to find their families and reunite with them. But I think it's really critically important for their descendants, and especially the first and second generation. I mean, it was just very critical to me to be able to do that for my mom.
Yeah, definitely. So a couple of questions, it looks like. Okay, so there is one from Jean asking about a birth, marriage, death register for Canada, like there is in the UK and Australia. She has a great aunt's uncle who went to Canada but can't find a site to give this information. Lori, do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I'm going to leave that to you because I don't think that we have any real site in Canada for that.
There is not. So there is
Yeah.
no national register for birth, marriage, death in Canada or United States. Actually, it's one of the reasons why research in North America can be so tricky compared to the UK. Jean, unfortunately, there's no easy answer there. You should probably start at the province level. You certainly could use Library Archives Canada and see if you can find something there at that's their national archive in Canada. But the province level is probably where you're going to need to access vital records. Don't overlook, of course, census records and kind of those other common tools to see if you can pinpoint a more specific location for your person. And then there was another one asking about the petition. A couple people were saying, where do you sign the petition? Who signs the petition to kind of ask the government of Canada for the apology? Yeah.
Well, we have an official Government of Canada apology that link is available in our Facebook group, the Home Children Canada Research Group. We also have one that it's called change.org that anybody from across the world can sign that one. But unfortunately, the most important one is the one that we can get signed by the citizens of Canada. It's unfortunate that people from around the world can't sign that petition, because I know that there would be just tremendous support for it.
Yeah, I think there's some of us that couldn't sign it fast enough, actually. Yeah. Bonnie commented about the inspection cards. She's saying, I'm not sure there were inspections in the early days. There was nothing about that in the records I got from Bernardo's. So do you know when inspections started and kind of the mass years? I do want to say it's closer to the turn of the century.
Well, they started, the Government of Canada inspection started around 1897, 1898. And, and they kind of continued on from there. There were some inspections that were done in the early years. I mean, I know that they did an inspection of all the Maria Rye children that were in Canada, and that was in about 1874, 1875. It really took them a long time to get the steam behind them to even start doing these inspections and stuff. And sometimes, Bonnie, too, It depends on like, I mean, when you got your records from Bernardo's, it also depends on where that child came from prior to Bernardo's,
Mm.
because I know that he took some children out of the workshops and stuff like that, and and sent them to Canada. But if they did that, then the amount of information that you're going to get in those records are not going to be as comprehensive as what you were going to get if the child had been directly admitted to Bernardo's.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
If they've gone through, an orphanage or a workhouse or something else before they land with a sending organization, obviously they're not talking to the biological parents anymore. They're not dealing directly with anybody with the family. So yeah, that's something I hadn't really thought about before.
No, there weren't, and there are lots of records that are still being held in the UK on our children. We've got Middlemore records, which are at I believe they're up at the Birmingham Archives.
I think that's right.
We have the Bernardo records, which are being held at their Making Connections office just outside of London, and the Fagan records, and we have Quarrier records, and so it's really important when people are talking to us that they let us know who sent their child to Canada, or to find out that information as soon as we can for individual people, so that we can move you in the right direction where you know where you're going to get that information from. But sometimes it's very comprehensive, and other times it's not. But I think for the most part, you're going to get lots of good information from the sending organizations.
Great. So we will finish up then today with a link to the British Home Children Registry, which is available on your site. Has many names of British home children and information about when they arrived and other details. So you can access that at BritishHomeChildrenRegistry.com. Thanks to Bobby for putting the link in the comments for us. Really appreciate that, Bobby. And you'll note that a lot of these individuals, and even Lori today, is wearing sunflowers. The sunflower is the symbol for British home children. And as we mentioned at the start, today is British Home Child Day. It's a day of recognition. You'll see a number of buildings across Canada that are being lit in memory of this population group, and there are some locations in the UK as well. But maybe Lori, finish us off with telling us about the sunflower. Why is the sunflower the symbol for the British home children?
It symbolizes their movement across Canada and how the seeds are kind of dispersed and multiplies like our families did. It was started by Judy Neville. The late Judy Neville started the sunflowers, and it's been, just widely adopted. And I think it's just a perfect symbol for the home children. September 28th is a very important day across this world for British Home Child Day. It was first in Ontario. It started in 2010, and then through Judy's efforts, the late Judy Neville, in 2018, it became a national day in Canada, but it is celebrated around the world. I mean, we now have our first, we call them beacons. So each tribute to the home children is called a beacon, and we call it Beacons of Light. It's called Beacons of Light because we have a lot of illuminations and stuff that are going on. Like we have the CN Tower in Canada and Niagara Falls. We have the Spinnaker Tower in Portsmouth in Hampshire that's going to be illuminating tonight in red, white, and blue. And we have the Town Hall in St. George's Hall in Liverpool that are going to be illuminating as well too. And what was that other place I was mentioning that we had? The lighthouse that they were doing.
Outside of
the Liso lighthouse just outside of Liverpool. And that really would have been one of the last things that the children saw when they were leaving Liverpool and coming to Canada. So it's going to be up in red, white, and blue tonight to celebrate the home children. And I think today is a day of reflection. It's a day of showing our gratitude to the children. It's a day to acknowledge those that suffered and those that didn't make it, that didn't do well. But we need to celebrate their contributions, their war efforts, the communities that they lived in, the communities that they serviced, and all of the descendants. And I think, that's one of their greatest legacies, is the descendants that, and their contributions. So we have to continue to recognize it, and we have to make sure that that these kids are never forgotten. Never again.
Yeah. Very well said. And thank you again so much for being with us. We will bring our hour together to a close, but I also want to thank all the members of the community, especially those who are active in home children research and are members of your Facebook group, Lori, who have been
You bet.
commenting and sharing links and sharing advice on the chat as we've gone. We really appreciate all of you as well. So thanks for a very interesting session. We'll hope to have you back on again
Thank
soon.
you.
That would be fantastic. And with that, we will leave you to the rest of your day, everybody. But join us again tomorrow, of course, for our usually scheduled Find My Past Fridays event. You'll get me twice in 1 week. So I'm doing the session tomorrow. Like it or love it, I guess, or maybe leave it. And we'll see you tomorrow. So one last question from Margaret, just to make sure everybody's aware. Is this being recorded and can I watch it later? Yes. This session was recorded. It will be available on the Find My Past Facebook and YouTube channels. And you're free to share, of course, when that's posted to anywhere you like, right, to share awareness for British home children. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us and have a wonderful
Thank you.
afternoon or evening.